I'm Zachary Spahr, and today we're going to learn about how the burning of a library, the storming of the president of SIU's house, and one of the biggest Vietnam War protests in the country led to changes in Southern Illinois University and the eventual end of the Vietnam War. We'll learn all about that and more today on
Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, Illinois, is one of the foremost leading colleges and universities in student activism. The roots of the proactive student government can be seen as early as 1962, when students organized the Student Nonviolent Freedom Committee to investigate racial discrimination. In 1966, all white members were ejected, and they formed the Radical Action Movement, which continued to sympathize with African Americans. However, they also expanded to student rights in general. Both of these organizations would embrace the protests that would come in May of 1970.
And one of the big fears of the authorities here throughout this period is that the black power advocates and the anti-war people were going to get together. That was their big nightmare.
In the spring of 1966, the first instances of violence occurred when students engaged in a panty raid of the female dorms. The Carbondale and SIU police used tear gas to disperse the crowd and made some arrests. It escalated further when a group of 2,000 students protested the police brutality. They were beaten with rat sticks. This incident underscores the relationship between the student body and city and school officials. Other spring riots would occur all the way until 1970. In 1967, events at SIUC began to heat up politically. Activist Ray Lindsay was elected student body president. He's considered by many as the father of the movement at SIU. In the fall of the same year, the Southern Illinois Peace Committee was formed. They protested military recruiting at the Student Center in the spring of 1968, and some were arrested. They would also embrace the protests of 1970. In a possibly related event, a bomb exploded in the Agriculture Building where the ROTC office was located on May 7, 1968. The next day, students rioted at the office of SIUC President Dwight Morris, who was often a target of students. In June of 1969, Old Main, the heart and the soul of the university, burned down.
And they said, well, there's a riot going on at the university, and they burned down Old Main. Old Main was the oldest building on campus, I think, and had been there since day one.
There was much skepticism surrounding the circumstances of the fire, but the spring of 1968 and onwards saw a rise in political temperature, which would continue until May 1970. The pinnacle of student protests occurred in May of 1970 and is known as the 7 Days in May. Major catalysts for this event were President Richard Nixon's announcement that U.S. forces were moving into Cambodia, the Vietnamese Study Center at SIUC, the Kent State shooting, and the tumultuous student body. On May 6, 1970, 2 days after 4 students were killed at Kent State by National Guardsmen, a large rally was held north of Morris Library. From there, students moved to Woody Hall, where the Vietnamese Center was located, and then to Wheeler Hall, where the ROTC was headquartered. They threw rocks, garbage cans, and bricks at the building and clashed with police. Chancellor McVicker called up the police in an attempt to possibly avoid another Kent State incident. Students immediately occupied both buildings and issued demands. They were cleared later that day. On May 7th, the lid blew off. Another rally occurred near Morris Library with about 2,000 students. At night, they moved to the intersection of Main Street and Illinois Avenue and downtown Carbondale. Once people moved to the railroad tracks, police moved in with the help of the National Guard. A massive tear gas assault led to the trashing of downtown Carbondale and general chaos. After students returned to campus, 600 National Guardsmen went to the area and tossed more tear gas. Mayor Keene declared a state of emergency in Carbondale. Groups of 10 or more people were prohibited, and a dusk to dawn curfew was in effect. On Friday, May 8th, there was another rally at Morris Library. At night, the National Guard blocked an area near Brush Towers where another rally was to be held. The clampdown continued on May 9th. The police and National Guard had been and continued to use tear gas and beatings indiscriminately.
I saw on Bridge Street students dragged out of a house through the windows and doors who were SDS members, and they were being manhandled and clubbed on the easement by the state police. So it was quite violent at the time.
On Sunday, May 10th, it appeared that Major Keene's civil emergency succeeded in calming the town. It was lifted Monday morning. However, students were tear gassed for assembling at the Newman Center. A historic day came on Tuesday, May 12th. Most of the state police and National Guard had left town. A rally of about 1,000 people began at Morris Library again. They moved downtown and it grew to 2,500. The crowd continued to grow and moved to the president's house. Some estimates put the size at 8,000 people. There are two conflicting reports of what happened that night. The first says that students threw rocks and bricks at the house before storming it and overwhelming police inside. The other says it was relatively peaceful, with only rocks being thrown. However, they both end the same. Chancellor McVicker appeared before the crowd at 11:30 p.m. and announced that the university would be closed for an indefinite period. The next day, the National Guard was called back, but there was very little violence. Many people left town. A referendum was held, and the students voted to stay closed. The RTC remained open, and the Vietnamese Center did poorly, and students voted 8,128 to 3,225 to remove or change it. SIU's protests, ranging from 1966 to 1970, were part of a much larger movement. The nationwide protests started with sporadic teach-ins during the beginning of the war and culminated in an all-out protest of the war. Some of the largest college protests were at SIU, as well as the UC Berkeley, the Kent State protests, and resulting Kent State shooting. These protests proved to be a strong force in the United States' eventual withdrawal from Vietnam. By putting pressure on Johnson and Nixon and turning public opinion against the war, the protesters proved to the world the power of a united movement. The Vietnam War protests proved to be the first protests in American history that actually had a significant impact on the war itself. This was in part due to increased media awareness and increased distribution of media.
It was certainly a turning point for people's participation in government policies. I was actually just asked by someone who's doing a project on adolescence during the Vietnam War what it was like to be a young person at that time. And I think I've talked to a lot of people like this. Those of us who grew up during those protests thought that's what you did when there was an issue that you cared strongly about. You went out in the street with 10,000 other people and made your views known. Of course, that didn't turn out to be the case forever, but it was a very important moment for that kind of protesting.
Previous war protests, such as the ones during the Civil War, World War I, and World War II, had not had the same effect. The rise of student awareness and the Cultural Revolution, exemplified by SIU, helped fuel the protests on a national scale and ultimately resulted in withdrawal from Vietnam. So today we learned about how the protests at SIU contributed to the United States withdrawing from Vietnam, and how the protests proved to the world the power of a united people, reinforcing the belief that a government represents the will of the people, not just the elected officials. Not only that, but these protests marked a turning point in history, where before the people's opinion of war was marginalized, and this marked the first time in American history where the people's opinion of a war held true sway in the American government.
Hi. We've certainly learned a lot today. The great modern historian Howard Zinn once said, "Protest beyond the law is not a departure from democracy, it's absolutely essential to it." And we've certainly learned how true that is today. Thanks for watching.
There's something happening here, but what it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware.